Uh, Thank you for starting the recording. Kuzuoğlu are offering this semester, and this is just going to be a casual meeting, as you all can tell. We'll start the Q&A at 8:35, but before then I'll have like a brief introduction, and we'll just hear about the courses a bit. And feel free to just type your questions in the chat or unmute, and of course keep your videos on as well. So I'll just start with the introduction. So Dr. Reynolds is a postdoctoral fellow in the university's history department. She specializes in Tibetan and Chinese history. Her newly published manuscript, Tibet Incorporated, Institutional Power and Economic Practice on the Sino-Tibetan Borderland from 1930 to 1950, details the cultural and political struggles within Kham, a Tibetan region within the last century. In the fall, Dr. Reynolds will offer History of Global Capitalism, from Slavery to Neoliberalism, an exploration into the reconfiguration of the global economic order throughout recent centuries. Dr. Reynolds will also offer Empire and Ethnicity, Qing Legacies in China and Inner Asia from 1600 till today. It focuses on the Qing dynasty, and the course will help dispel the misconception of a monolithic Chinese identity and culture. Professor Kuzuoğlu is an assistant professor of modern Chinese and global history. In recent years, his research has focused on the evolution of Chinese writing and scripts throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, and he presented his findings in his 2018 book project, Codes of Modernity. He'll be offering Cyborgs in History next semester, and it's going to look at the intersection between technology and global society in a variety of contexts. He'll also offer Technology, Empire, and Science in China to investigate the history of science and transnational knowledge transfer between China and the world between the 13th and 20th centuries. So, with that, Dr. Reynolds, feel free to open us up and discuss your courses.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. You covered pretty much everything I could have possibly said. So yeah, my name is Elizabeth Reynolds, and it was very nice of you to say my manuscript. I just finished my PhD back in 2020. And I am really looking forward to continuing to teach courses on China, Chinese history, Chinese economic history, the borderlands, Tibetan borderlands. I like to try to keep a broad, I have a couple of different seemingly disparate interests, one being economics, one being borderlands, one the Sino-Tibetan frontier. And so I really enjoy teaching a wide variety of courses. And in particular, the course Empire and Ethnicity is going to be a new course for me. I've recently taught a course that Serena was in, Cultural Encounters, which covered from the Mongol Empire, roughly from the Mongol Empire to today. And as well as this semester teaching the Silk Roads and Empire course, as well as economic history of China. The Qing, the Ethnicity and Empire course will be building off these other courses that I've taught, but will focus primarily on the Qing dynasty up through today. And so thinking about what this multi-ethnic empire, the Qing, which many of you I'm sure are very familiar with, what the kind of legacies that we've been left with, and what sort of issues the PRC today is still confronting, and what the people are still confronting across what is a very large, broad area that reached its geographic expanse during this Qing Empire period. And so we're still contending with a lot of the issues that began and sort of formed during this earlier period. But I really look forward to discussing this further with all of you, and I will leave it at that.
Awesome. And with that, Professor Kuzuoğlu, feel free to talk about your courses too.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. So I'm just gonna piggyback on what Dr. Reynolds said about my interest as well. So I finished my PhD about 3 years ago, and I was working at Columbia before coming here. And my book, which I've just submitted the manuscript of for publication, so I'm glad that you mentioned my book's title, Codes of Modernity, and it's a book about information technologies, and it's a book really about how to think about information technologies within the context of China. So the book specifically looks at scripts, and it thinks of scripts as information technologies, as a way of coding. You know, in a literal sense, it's a sort of coding before the age of computers, and thinking about coding as a way to think about what information meant, and why the Chinese intellectuals and reformers wanted to change the script in different ways from the 1890s onward. So my research is sort of falls at the intersection between technology and society, broadly speaking, but in particular, it's really about history of information technologies. So at WashU last semester, I taught two courses, and this sort of gives you an idea of the general intellectual interest that I have, which is one was called History of Information, and the other one was called Science. And this was a graduate seminar, so it was called Science and Technology in East Asia. And then this semester, I'm teaching History of Modern China. So I'm sort of trying to teach courses either on China or on information related topics or something that brings the two together. So next semester, as you mentioned, I'm teaching two courses. One of them is really not about China, and then the other one is entirely about China. The first one that you mentioned, Cyborgs in History, is sort of a fascination of mine. I used to be an avid science fiction reader. I haven't been really reading that much science fiction lately. But then I got really interested in sort of histories of computer technologies and sort of how computers made people think about humanness in different ways. And the best example for this is the idea of the cyborg, right? I mean, if you think about cyborg in popular culture, from Star Trek to Star Wars to RoboCop to Westworld today, you just see cyborgs everywhere, and I think it's a really fascinating way to think about how technology and humanity or humanities intersect with one another. So that course is really going to be about the whole idea of the intersection between computer technologies and humanities discourses. So it's going to be kind of, I still don't quite know what the finalized syllabus is going to look like, but I think it's going to be a little bit wild in terms of really thinking about the theory of mind, really thinking about sort of what cyborg discourse did for queer theory, what cyborg discourse did for race theory, what cyborg discourse did for different kinds of theories, and also how this whole cyborg discourse changed, or the way we think about computers changed from the 1950s to today. When you think about computers, it's really funny because like in the 1970s, 80s, a lot of people, not only in the US, but just around the world, thought that computers were this revolutionary thing that was going to be great for all sorts of things, like and where we are with Facebook and Twitter and all of these, big tech conglomerates. You're like, okay, where are we really going with this, right? So what exactly does the computer do in our society? Is it like a liberating force, or is it actually an enslaving force? But that's going to be the kind of tension that I want to explore in that class. The second one is Empire Science and what was it called? Technology, Empire, and Science. Is that what it's called? Technology, Empire, and Science. I had to come out with that name like in 2 minutes because it had to be, just submitted. So I always forget the name, but I think it's called Technology, Empire, and Science. And it's another sort of thing that I've been working on for a long time, and that's really about how to think about science and technology in the context of China. So what is Chinese science? Can there be something called Chinese science or Chinese technology? And if there is, what does that even mean? And how do we really think about the the development and the evolution of Chinese science or Chinese technologies from the Mongolian period all the way into the modern period. So the patterns can we see, and how can we really situate this history of Chinese science and technology within a larger global history? So, for instance, what were the Jesuits doing in China in the 17th and 18th centuries? What kind of technological inventions did they bring? What kind of technological inventions did the Muslims bring to China? And how did Muslim, Jesuit, sort of Muslim, Christian, Chinese science and technologies converge to create something new? And what does that even look like? And what should we call that? So those are the kinds of questions that we're going to explore in that class. And with that, I'm just going to be quiet and hear what kind of questions you have for us.
I mean, wow, I'm just so impressed. And two words that came to my mind as you were speaking, Professor, and Dr. Reynolds, is just like reimagining and creativity, because like we're reimagining like what is the Qing Empire? It's really this diverse empire, and with your course, we're going to have a different idea about computing and other areas of information transfer and knowledge sharing and transfer in China. So interesting. And I know you have questions too, so we can start the question period a bit early. Feel free to unmute if you have a question or put them in the chat. So I'll start us off. So Dr. Reynolds, do you know how big your classes are going to be next semester?
Great question. So both of my courses are going to be they're going to be capped at 15 students. So both are going to be small seminar classes, which will emphasize discussion, and I will probably give some short lectures at the beginning of each class, maybe a PowerPoint here and there, but the real emphasis is going to be on discussing the books and the readings that will be assigned, and hopefully just engender a really great conversation.
Okay. And I know we're like exiting this odd time of COVID, so we have like a lot of our classes online. Are we looking for both professors to have our classes like in person? Okay.
Yeah. The class is not going to be in person. My class is also going to be 15, capped at 15. And I think what the university policy right now is to have the small classes in person with masks on. And then if the class is larger than like 100, then it can be online. So that's what I heard last time. But in any case, I think we will both be having the classes in person.
Cool.
Professor, oh, sorry. Go ahead, Chloe.
Sorry to cut you off, Paige. I had a question about let me make sure I'm getting the name right, Technology, Empire, and Science in China class. So good name, by the way. So I was wondering, I know that this class is about more of the history of science, but I was thinking more in terms of today. We know that there's issues in terms of intellectual property rights, which also has to do with science development, and even thinking about science in terms of vaccine developments and trading transnationally, those ideas. Do you think we can come up with ways to kind of use the science to bring us together? Or what do you think do you think that's going to be the key connector between China and the United States with all of our quandaries that we have with each other?
Wow, that is a difficult question. I don't know if I'm going to be able to give you a coherent answer, because I'm not really clear on this either. It's obviously a contested issue, and one of the things I think, one of the interesting parts of studying history is to show how always contested all of these issues were. Like there was never a time when science or technological development was not contested, right? It was just contested in different ways, and in different kinds of ideological formations informed the contestation in different ways. So I think right now, to give you a short answer, no, I don't think science is going to help us sort of bridge the differences that have emerged between China in the past 10 to 15 years, I would say. I think I think in thinking about this question, it's perhaps useful to think about why we have these clashes in the first place, right? Like what exactly is the driving force here? Is the driving force really about, oh, China is just stealing knowledge, which is something that people have done for thousands of years, like everyone steals knowledge from one another. Is that really the sort of key issue here, or is this sort of use it as an excuse for bringing out other kinds of problems that either the United States or China does not really want to deal with directly, or can we think about this within a larger sort of political economic transformation, globally speaking, in which China is becoming more powerful in creating technologies and sciences that will drive global economy forward in different ways, right? Think about 5G. I mean, that's like the first example that comes to mind. Like 5G and it's really it's a war over who's going to control the space, the digital space, going forward, right? It's very similar to what was happening in the 19 teens and 20s when radio was first invented and it was exported to China, and the whole sort of fight was over who was going to have control over the radio waves in China, who was going to build these what are they called, the long wave radio stations. Is it going to be the British, or is it going to be the Germans? Is it going to be the French? And who is going to build this, and who is going to have actually more control over the territory itself? So there are all these I guess parallels that you can draw between earlier technologies and how they serve the interests of Western empires or Western colonialism, and today's technologies that are serving the interest of Chinese imperialism or Chinese colonialism or American imperialism and colonialism again. I mean, this is it's a fight over resources at the end of the day. It's a fight over influence. And when you have two empires fighting, the US and China, science can only be a contested issue. It cannot really bring them together. At least that's the way I'm seeing it, and that's the way that it has developed in the past. And also there are a lot of, I don't want to take too much time with it's such a loaded question, and I have so many ideas. I don't really know where to start and where to end. But like one of the interesting things, for instance, that happened about under Obama's administration, like it was like 2009 or 2010, when there was clearly some sort of stealing happening by Chinese agricultural companies, and they were stealing from, I think, from either from Iowa or another Midwestern state. And the whole point was, okay, how do we get these seeds in order to increase productivity levels in Chinese corn production? And this became a huge sort of, this was apparently a big debate and a big sort of contested field that the FBI got really involved in, and it just dragged on for years and years. And it wasn't, back then, it wasn't really known that well. I mean, I don't remember reading about this that well. So today, hearing about the Huawei issues or the 5G or the other kinds of intellectual property theft that's going on, I feel like it is a cover for these deeper problems that the two countries are facing today, which weren't really, in front of our faces 15 years ago, even though the same problems were still there. So I'll just leave it there. But thank you for the question. That was a really good question.
Yeah, thank you so much for your answer. I know that was a very open-ended question, but that was very interesting.
And Paige, did you have a question too?
Yeah, I had a question for Dr. Reynolds about ethnicity, and you're covering this period of hundreds of years of Chinese history following this topic of ethnicity, which is like so pertinent in Chinese society today. And I was just wondering like how that concept, I know you probably go over this in much more detail in your class, but how that concept has evolved over that time period, and several changes in government. And
That's a great question, and it's not one that has an easy answer, as you know, as you alluded to. What's really interesting about China, or one of the many interesting things, is there's certainly and one of the kind of broader themes that I tend to teach in a number of my classes is this kind of constructed nature of the nomads and the center, the peripheries in the center, the nomads and the sedentary, the barbarians and the civilized. These are really strong binaries that exist within Chinese discourse in a historical, in a historical sense. The self and the other. These are, constant things that come up in, across time and space and disciplines, but it's not, there's quite a lot of room for interrogation within the Chinese, within not only the narrative that's been constructed about Chinese history. I mean, you're probably all familiar with that, the adage of 5,000 years of history, and there's this really strong core of what we now identify, or some usually call the Han group, or Han ethnicity. But of course, like all words and sort of all of these different kinds of constructs and concepts, there's an element of social construction that goes along with them. And to be sure, ethnicity as a concept that we have and use today is a construct of the 20th century, maybe late 19th to early 20th century, at least for the case of China. And so there's always a little bit of a pitfall in thinking, we don't want to apply the ethnicity or any of these terms anachronistically. Yet at the same time, creating identity and establishing a group identity vis-a-vis others is a tension and something we can and should trace and have long-lasting consequences. So, I mean, so by going back to the Qing, using the Qing dynasty and going into the 20th century to today, it gives us a really, I mean, you could bring this all the way back really to the Han dynasty, to the Tang dynasty, where, very famous individuals are dealing with this kind of construction of identity and ethnicity as such. But I'm choosing to really focus on the Qing dynasty because what you have with the Qing, not terribly dissimilar from previous dynasties, at least a couple. They're a conquest dynasty. The Manchus are, a pastoral nomadic group that come in from the north. And they eventually, they take over this huge area of land from Mongolia to what is now Xinjiang to what is now Tibet, all of the different regions of Tibet. And even northern Yunnan have in relationships with Korea. It's this extensive empire, but that's also a sort of ideological cosmology of all of these different groups that one can constructively think of as ethnicities. So what you might then ask is, and one of the big questions that we'll try to grapple with is, why are we saying ethnicity and not race? What are the differences between these two things? Do we, is this a constructive thing to be trying to deal with? And many of the leaders of China in its various forms were trying to deal with these questions too. So that's, I'll leave it at that. But it's a really interesting question, and as mentioned earlier, it's of the utmost importance today with everything that's happening in Xinjiang and Tibet, and what identity can mean and should mean.
All right, and if there are any other questions, feel free to unmute or put them in the chat.
I took Dr. Elizabeth's class last semester, so I think I can share something about it. Okay, so I think the diversity of sources is something I appreciate the most about this class. Yeah, like usually when we take a class on Chinese history, we only read like secondary source. Yeah, because we had to read it in English. Yeah, but somehow she managed to find like a lot of primary sources. Yeah, like the Buddhist, like Lotus Sutra, things like that. So translated versions of that. So I think that is a very good alternative to just reading like secondary sources and commentaries written by other scholar. Yeah, without like interacting with the sources firsthand. Yeah, I think it's very hard to exactly describe like what are my takeaways from this primary source. Yeah, like things like the Lotus Sutra, it's not something that you can just like link directly to your own paper or your own class. Yeah, but somehow the learning you derive from that is, I would say, very enriching. Yeah, because you have to figure out a lot of the relevance on your own. Yeah, so I highly recommend this class, and also I recommend Professor Kuzuoğlu's class. Yeah, I like how he really like bring out the social and cultural aspects of technology, of how the Chinese population engaged and interacted with this technology culture. Yeah, especially after the reform period, because that's something that I'm personally very interested in. Yeah, like I had never looked at technology that way, because when we think of technology, we think about a lot of politics, like the arms race, things like that. Yeah, we kind of neglect the social cultural aspect of technology. Yeah, and also because in WashU we don't really have a lot of China related course. Yeah, so all the courses I took like previously were with Professor Ma. Yeah, who tends to focus more on the political aspect. Yeah, so I think these classes are a very good complement to what you learn. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing, Serena. And we have a question in the chat from Chloe. To both professors, have you studied Chinese before? And what got you interested in studying Chinese, if so?
Yeah, sure. I'll take a stab. Yes. First of all, thank you, Serena, for the introduction. That was really sweet of you. I When did I start learning Chinese? It was 2006 when I started learning Chinese. And what got me interested in studying China? For me, it was it was a few different things. I was just always interested in East Asia. I grew up in Turkey, and I went to college in Turkey as well. And while I was in college, I was increasingly interested in East Asia. And there was only one professor who later on became my advisor, and she was the only one who was working on East Asia in general, and she was a historian of Japan. So I was really interested in history of Japan when I first started college. And then later on, my college was very left wing, and the kind of education that I got was a lot of reading Marx, a lot of Marx, and I loved it. I still love it, but it also sort of got me, interested in China, just because of that, sort of thinking about history of socialism, or thinking about history of socialist thought, and being interested in East Asia, sort of got me interested in thinking about 20th century China. And that was really when I think I was a junior, was when I was really just really getting into 20th century, just sort of trying to understand 20th century China. And I didn't really have anyone around me to ask, apart from one professor who was a historian of Japan and not really of China. So it was sort of that moment of, not really having anyone that got me really excited, just even more to like explore it myself and try to understand myself. And that's how I got into starting to learn Chinese. And then I went to China to learn more Chinese, to stay there, to do more research and so on and so forth. And then one thing led to another, and I'm here.
Thank you. And Dr. Reynolds?
Yeah. So, I was thinking of how I would answer this question. Yeah, I started learning Chinese as a freshman in college. So that was back in 2007. But it was really before that I started to become really interested in China. I had an opportunity to go when I was actually in middle school. And from that point on, it was kind of all about wanting to get back. And so I ended up studying for a summer in high school, even before college. And once I started college and taking Chinese classes, I really fell in love with the language. I had taken languages before, but nothing had really been as exciting as taking Chinese. And I proceeded to spend every summer and 2 semesters of my undergraduate career in China, mostly in Yunnan province, which is where I got introduced to minority cultures in China, and was really exposed to just, I mean, Yunnan is an area of incredible diversity, being, you know, right up against Southeast Asia, Tibet. And so I got introduced, I started actually really getting involved in minority art, in particular Tibetan Thangka painting. And that research and that interest actually propelled me to get a Fulbright scholarship after I graduated college, and I ended up spending 2 years living in Qinghai province, which is, for those of you who might not know, it's the Tibetan region of Amdo, is pretty much all of Qinghai with a little bit of Gansu and Sichuan. And so living, you know, I'd been living in Yunnan for a while, but then I was living in Qinghai, and, you know, I was taking Chinese this whole time and working on the painting and research on the Tibetan painting commercialization process, which is what I mainly did my research in at that early stage. And that was when I started learning Tibetan, which I continued to pursue for most of my graduate career. And, you know, Chinese was always kind of the lingua franca of this broader Tibetan region. Tibetan has many dialects and was never standardized. So I ended up, you know, with a lot of my friends speaking a mixture of Tibetan and Chinese, and even learning Tibetan in Chinese, and had quite a lot of fun doing that. So that's what got me into doing research. And once I started my graduate career, I ended up moving backwards in time, but focusing still quite a lot on these, you know, deeper economic issues, and economic issues that overlap a lot with moral issues or religious issues. So monastic economies is a big thing that I work on. And, you know, the kind of the issues with trading and selling religious objects, for example. So yeah, I love studying languages. You know, it's been a couple years now that I haven't I haven't been back to China in almost 2 years now, and I'm just dying to get back, but I'll leave it at that.
Yes, very interesting that both of you were interested in Chinese from a young age. And Professor Kuzuoğlu, I mean, when you were younger, did you have any experience with other Chinese dialects?
Apart from Mandarin, no.
Mhm.
No. Mandarin is the only Chinese language I learned. I was really interested in Shanghainese when I was living in Shanghai, but I never got to learn it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, with that, I do have another question. So, does your course cover Chinese agricultural technology? It seems like it's an interesting topic given Chinese government's concentration in rural development and demographics. It also seems to tie into Dr. Reynolds' topic, since most of the large state farms that they test this technology on the regional frontiers.
Yeah, that's a really good question. The course will actually start with agriculture because there's a fantastic book on agricultural technologies in China from the Mongol, even from the Song Dynasty onward, and sort of really thinking about what technology means and what technology means, especially in rice production and agricultural production at large. So yes, I will start there, and it's I mean, your sort of, you know, your impulse is correct in that China was an agrarian, you know, civilization, let's call it. So there was a lot of technology that was taking shape around agriculture at large, and that just, you know, continued all the way into the 20th century. So especially during the socialist period, that was a big part of it. How do we create new technologies and new sciences for the countryside, for the rural population? And that has a huge history, and I will definitely get into that. That's, as I said, that's where I'm going to start. It does tie a little bit into Dr. Reynolds's research as well, even though I mean, I'll let her speak to that, because I think it gets really complicated, especially in Tibet, where agriculture is not really a Chinese thing, right? I mean, when you think about sort of Chinese agriculture, you know, it's the Nadi, right? It's the inner province, it's the sort of the mainland, the core provinces that you think about. You don't really think about Xinjiang or Tibet. Obviously, Mongolia is not, you know, it's a different kind of economy. But also, you know, it's just going back to what Dr. Reynolds was saying about the Qing Empire. It is interesting to see that it was only in the Qing Empire that the Qing or China at large incorporated Xinjiang into its territories, right? And one of the first things that they really wanted to do in the late 18th century and then moving on into the 19th century as well was to start planting rice, because that's what they knew. And for them, that was what civilization was, right? So you plant rice, and once you plant rice, people will become cinified. They will become civilized. They will, you know, just leave their own traditions and whatnot, and they will adapt to this civilized agrarian life. It never took off because it's Xinjiang, and it's not, you know, it's not inner China, and it's a different kind of culture. So I would say that, you know, there's definitely some sort of bifurcation between what we know as the core provinces and the frontiers. And I think the way in which science and technology played out is also quite different in two places.
Very interesting. And with that, we'll begin wrapping up. Feel free to continue asking questions. And are there any questions?
Well, I have a question.
Of course,
I have a
go
question
ahead.
for all of you. I'm wondering what kind of courses you would like to see going forward.
That's a good one. I'll leave the floor open to anyone.
If I were still going to be at WashU next year, I would be taking both of your classes. I just want to say that. I am personally very interested in Chinese ethnic issues, and also in Chinese agricultural technology in particular. So I am so disappointed to be graduating this May.
Yeah, Paige, that's a really good point. And I'll have the opportunity to take both of these courses. So we'll look into that for sure. But I think for me, in addition to these two courses, I think that a course explaining how the US and China's tension will evolve in the post-COVID age, I think that's really something to look into.
Yeah, more of a contemporary, like a political science kind of course, you mean?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to piggy off of that as well. I think modern issues in China, whether it's ethical issues, political issues, and how China interacts with the rest of the world because they have a different political system, those are all topics that I'm eager to explore.
Unfortunately, our school doesn't have like any Chinese political scientists in the political science department. Yeah, so I mean, apart from contemporary, I'm actually very interested to know like what is the minority, like Chinese ethnic minorities' opinion of the world. Yeah, like when we talk about like China's encounter with the world, we focus on the inner province a lot, like how do mainland Chinese people perceive Westerners? Yeah, but I'm actually curious, like how do like ethnic minority, how do they look at Westerners? Like for example, when our professors, like Professor Kuzuoğlu is in China, how does the minority people actually perceive you, or how do they interact with you? I mean, you can
respond to
talk
that.
about it now if you want.
It depends. Yeah, sure. I mean, it depends on where I am. I'll give you two minority groups. One was when I was in where was I? I was in South, and as was meant, that's a Tibetan area, the larger Tibetan area. So it was, you know, it was 97% or something. And one of the guys, I was speaking Chinese, and one of the guys said, you know, like, how you doing, blah, blah, blah. And then he goes, oh, like, you're Han. And I said, what are you even talking about? Like, how can you look at me and say that I'm Han? Like, I don't look like Han at all. But it was like, for him, like, I was just not from there, and that was it, right? I did not look like him, and he was, you know, he was probably like a farmer or something over there, and he was like, wait a minute, who doesn't look like me should be Han, and that's kind of it, and that was his like cartographic imagination. And yeah, I obviously didn't know what Turkey was or anything, so that was one sort of experience that I had. Second one was when I was in Xinjiang, which was very different, because in Xinjiang, it's the land of Uyghurs, and Uyghurs are basically a Turkic ethnic group, right? So it's so the language that they speak is basically 50% intelligible to me as a Turkish speaker. So I would actually, like, you know, I would speak Turkish and they would speak Uyghur, and we would like understand one another. So for them, me being from Turkey was just like, you know, like a long lost brother who just like came to hang out with them. And that was just a completely different way of interacting with a minority population, and that wouldn't really be the case in any other minority region, right? I mean, that is really specific to Xinjiang, and specific to the linguistic familiarity that we shared at the time. So yeah, that was my experience. This, I don't want to universalize this in any way, but that was what I had in China.
And Serena, you're right. It would be cool to explore even more perspectives on what different cultural identities in China, how they perceive the world. And we have our last two questions in the chat. So our first is for Professor Reynolds. He says, you mentioned that you started with a broad interest in Chinese minority and eventually set your focus on Tibetan. May I know what led you from the broad interest to the niche focus?
Yeah. And before I jump onto that question, I did want to add, you know, I really would love in the future to teach a course on really the 20th century to today. You know, I think these kinds of questions that we're all facing about China-US tensions and this kind of geopolitical space that we're currently in, you will always gain something really valuable from looking at the past, and you know, and particularly the last 100, maybe 150 years, if we're really, you know, trying to think critically about this US-China relationship, or the China foreign Western relationship. And so I really do hope to teach more courses on this 20th century period, and because it's a period I care quite a bit about. And what's happening today is, of course, on everybody's minds. But the question about how I, you know, started kind of large and went to the Tibetan years, well, I have to admit, part of it was that I was at Barnard College for my undergrad, so, you know, connected to Columbia University, and Columbia University is one of the very few universities in the world that has a Tibetan history program. And so from a very early age, I was able to take courses on Tibetan history and work with professors at Columbia and Barnard. And they were just extremely supportive of my interests, of my work, you know, and so I think that had a lot to do with it. But also from just like a personal experience, when I was living in Yunnan, the Tibetans who I got to know and worked with, they were just so inviting. And this actually leads back to the question, you know, about how minorities in China interact with foreigners. And specifically for the Tibetan case, because of the Tibetans in exile and because of that longer history of relationships with India and the United States in particular, there was kind of this underlying, you know, camaraderie from a kind of political standpoint. And this might have been a little bit on the surface level, but real nonetheless. And so a lot of the Tibetans I met initially spoke English. Their English, in a lot of cases, was a lot better than my Chinese friends, just because they had this international network that they were connected to. And American, they were, very interested initially in just getting to know me. There's a lot more to be said about that, but there was certainly, an element, there was a sort of dual element of this kind of fun, like engaging group of people. And Tibetan history has, it's really a civilization in, if we're going to be using the term civilization, there's a written canon since around the 700s. And a Tibetan empire during the early Tang Dynasty period, so that rivaled the Tang Dynasty, actually took over Chang'an for about a week or two. And so we have this really rich, long history. And so for me, coming in with this larger China focus, studying Chinese, I felt, really strongly inclined to not only study Tibetan and study this Tibetan region, but to try to better understand this relationship, which, as you all know, is filled with quite a lot of tension.
Wow. And
Thank you, guys.
Dr. Reynolds, your passion really rubs off on all of us. Here's us to Professor Kuzuoğlu, and I'll close with the final question. So we here at the China Forum really value discussion on China and discourse, and history is great, but the future is a bit frightening. So in one word, how would you describe your outlook on the U.S.-China relationship?
Dr. Reynolds is not unmuting herself, so I guess I'm gonna be the one to take a stab at this one. It's so again, it's a difficult question, and it's such an open-ended question, and I would actually be really curious to hear what you all think. Just just from the perspective that you're gaining from newspapers and blogs and op-eds and whatnot. The way I think about it is that it's not going in a favorable direction, sadly. And I am blaming both sides in this. How should I phrase this in a way that's going to be sort of coherent and concise? First of all, what's interesting to see is that when it comes to China, it doesn't really matter if it's the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, right? You can be a Republican or you can be a Democrat. They basically have the same understanding of China, which is China as this sort of big evil that's becoming a new empire. And I find that extremely disturbing. I find it extremely annoying, and I find it extremely ignorant. And I think people in the White House don't have actual understanding of what they're actually facing, or at least that's the way in which they want to convey themselves to the greater public. Even if they know more, they don't want to show that. So it's sort of creating this straw man of an enemy, and building off of that. We've seen this in the earlier decades as well. This is not the first time that the United States is doing this, right? I mean, this was exactly what happened before the invasion of Iraq. I mean, for months and months and months, even for more than that, there was this constant propaganda of how Saddam Hussein's regime was just against human rights, against this, against that, all using the buzzwords that you need to use, to legitimize some sort of an attack. And that's really what we're seeing today. I mean, I'm really hoping that it's not going to end up in some sort of a war, but the way it's going is really concerning me, to be honest. Like what started under Trump with the cancellation of what's it called, Fulbright, right? I mean, that was the bread and butter of a lot of people. Dr. Reynolds herself also was a Fulbright scholar in China. That was how sort of cultural contact was established between this and China, and now we just don't have it. So what is this ignorance? Even more in 10 to 15 years. So these and Biden administration did not do anything to bring that back, right? If anything, Biden administration is actually being as hawkish as the Trump administration when it comes to China. So taking all of these into account, and also taking into account China's own imperial ambitions that are really resurfacing today, it seems like it's going to be a hard battle to fight, metaphorically speaking. I mean, you just heard, just a couple of days ago, the Chinese fighter jets got into the Taiwanese territory again, and there was this big thing with the Biden administration and Biden being like, Taiwan is our ally and this and that. Well, like within the kind of public discourse, there is a kind of the free world against the dark communist world kind of discourse that's still happening, and that's really a kind of a product or an offspring of the Cold War discourse of sort of this U.S. versus China, like free world versus communism, which does not mean anything, in fact, but it does capture the imaginations of the people, and the United States is still banking on that kind of discourse. What's different today is that, unlike the Cold War, China actually does have a lot of projects around the world that make it into, it's the second largest economy in the world, right? It's no longer the 1970s today. So the way in which this battle is going to pan out is scary to think about. So that's where I stand. But what do you think, Daniel, since you raised the question?
So I think fear. That's one word that comes to mind. But I'm not myself afraid. I'm just concerned about the future that, my family and my children might live in. And if you could bottle all of that, all those feelings up in one word, what do you think it would be, Professor Kuzuoğlu?
So for you, it's fear. Is that the word that you came up with? For me, I guess it would be frustration. I'm frustrated. I'm frustrated at the ignorance. I'm not afraid of it. I'm frustrated at the ignorance, and I'm think to be down. This is it, right? That correct policies can actually bring out correct kinds of changes, but we need the right kind of people in order to make those changes, and I don't see that in the American politics.
Okay, and Dr. Reynolds, and we'll close with that.
Yeah. I share these feelings. I really do. And so all that I will add to this is all of this just increases the importance of students like you all who are paying attention to China, to thinking about it, studying its history, and promoting knowledge and discourse and conversations. This is going to be increasingly important in the coming years. And so, I mean, thank you all so much for taking this interest and for inviting us. And we really hope to see you in our classes and keep promoting this kind of intellectual engagement. So really, thank you.
Likewise, and we hope to see you again, Professor Reynolds, Professor Kuzuoğlu, here at the China Forum. So thank you all for coming, and feel free to email these professors if you have any other questions. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. And if you're free tomorrow morning, feel free to come for our event. We have an event titled From the Qing Empire to Chinese Nation State. Yeah. Is
that the Wang Gongwu?
Yeah, it is. We have more than 500 slides.